Section 17 of the Story of London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Paul Lawley Jones. The Story of London by Henry B. Wheatley. Chapter 8. The Governors of the City, Part 3. At the coronation of Henry VI, 6th of November 1429, William Estfield, the recently elected mayor, received the customary gold cup and ewer used on the occasion, which he afterwards bequeathed to his grandson. The latest instance of this jealously guarded privilege occurred at the coronation of George IV, July 19, 1821. The claim to this honourable service in the cases of the coronations of William IV and Queen Victoria was not made because no banquet took place on these occasions. In the case of the coronation of His present Majesty, the claim was excluded from the consideration of the Court of Claims under the Royal Proclamation. The terms of the judgment on a further claim is as follows. Quote, "The Court considers and adjudges that the Lord Mayor has by usage a right, subject to His Majesty's pleasure, to attend the Abbey during the coronation and bear the crystal mace." End quote. It will be seen that of these four special privileges, two relate to the mayor's position in the city and two to his position outside the city. The pageants connected with the election of the mayor are of great antiquity, but we have little information respecting the earlier ones. It is a tradition that when the mayoralty was granted by the king, a stipulation was made that the mayor should be presented for approval either to the king or his justiciar, and the processions then commenced. In 1415, the mayor proceeded to Westminster on horseback, but in 1453 Sir John Norman, the mayor, was infirm, and he introduced the custom of making the progress from London to Westminster by barge. This continued till the horseback procession was revived in 1657, much to the disgust of the London watermen. Even when the water procession was the regular practice, the procession on horseback to the Guildhall and then to the waterside for embarkation took place. No Lord Mayor in a city procession used a coach before 1712, and then only an ordinary one. The present state coach was built in 1757. Sir John Shah, Mayor in 1482, was the first to give the annual banquet in the Guildhall. Previously, the feast had taken place either at Grocers' Hall or some other convenient place. The practice of dining at the Guildhall did not become general until 1501, when alterations were made in the kitchen, and the requisite offices having been added, the series of annual banquets was commenced there. There was no feeling of contempt of trade in the Middle Ages, and the merchant princes of London were held in high esteem. The custom of ridiculing the city and its rulers did not then exist, but it seems probable that it first came into being in the reign of Elizabeth. Richard Johnson's 9 Worthies of London, 1592, contains the praise of the worthies, written by the author in a mock heroic style. Of the 9, 4 were mayors, namely Sir William Walworth, 1374-1380, Sir Henry Pritchard, Pickard, 1356, Sir William Sevenoke, 1418, and Sir William White, 1553. Most of the mayors of the Middle Ages were men of birth and position, and it is difficult to understand how it was that the popular idea of a poor boy coming up to London penniless, making his way here, and eventually rising to be mayor, first came into existence. The elaboration of this idea in the chapbook Life of Sir Richard Whittington is entirely opposed to the facts of the case. Alderman. The consideration of the actual position of the alderman in the government of London is one of great difficulty, and Mr. Round's discovery of the Oath of the Commune in which aldermen are not mentioned has made it difficult to conjecture when it was that they took their natural place as the advisers of the mayor. The title alderman is a survival of the Saxon period, as is also that of sheriff, but the duties of the holders of the office have frequently been changed. The word alderman was a generic term as well as the distinctive title of a special officer. King Alfred appointed an alderman over all London, and the chief officer of the various guilds was originally known as an alderman. The various wards were each presided over by an alderman from an early period, but, as already noted, we cannot fix the date when they were united as a court of aldermen. Bishop Stubbs writes, quote, "The governing body of London in the 13th century was composed of the mayor, 25 aldermen of the wards, and 2 sheriffs. All these were elective officers." End quote. The difficulty is that although aldermen were undoubtedly elected as the heads of wards, they are not referred to as the colleagues of the mayor until the very end of this century. In March 1298 to 1299, letters were sent from, quote, "the mayor and commune of the city of London, to the échevins, jurats, and commonalty of the town of Bruges, to the provost, bailiffs, and commonalty of the town of Caen, and to the provost, échevin, and commonalty of the city of Comerac, possibly Cambrai." End quote. Although the official form of the mayor and commune was continued until the end of the 13th century, and it was not until early in the 14th century that the form mayor, alderman, and common council came into existence, there is sufficient evidence to show that the alderman and common council before that time were acting with the mayor as governors of the city. As already quoted from Bishop Stubbs, that authority describes the aldermen as assistants of the mayor as early as 1249. At all events, in the record of the election of aldermen in 1293, they are specially described as elected for the government of the city. In 1299, 27 Edward I, quote, "It was agreed by Henry Legales, mayor, and the alderman that Strago, the sweeper of litter in the ward of Cheap, should be taken and imprisoned until, etc., because he, the said Strago, had scandalized the aldermen by saying that they take the money of the commonalty at the Guildhall under pretext of wardship of orphans, and then waste such money for their own profit." End quote. In consequence of these unfounded charges, Strago was committed to the Tun. There are in Riley's memorials about this date several other references to aldermen acting with the mayor. Thus, on the 14th of September 1301, quote, "Walter Swan appeared before Sir Elias Russell, Mayor of London, and other aldermen then present." End quote. And in December 1310, Roger de Ure, having insulted and assaulted Richard de Gloucester, alderman, the two parties, quote, "appeared in the Guildhall before Sir Richard de Reffham, the mayor, and the alderman." End quote. In 1311, 4th Edward II, the form of description of the governors was, quote, "the mayor, alderman, and the common council of the city." End quote. From this time, the general form was either this or, quote, "the mayor, alderman, and commonalty." End quote. It is necessary, however, to mention that a congregation of mayor and alderman is referred to in Fitz-Aylwin's Assize of 1189. The title of échevin, as applied to a governor of the city, is at present only known to us as used in the Oath of the Commune, found by Mr. Round, and it may therefore have had a very short existence. It is possible that aldermen were elected onto the mayor's council under the title of échevins. This, however, is not the opinion of Mr. Round, who is inclined to believe that the body of échevins became, in course of time, the Court of Common Council. The whole question is at present one of great difficulty, and I only state the facts here without venturing to express any confident opinion until more evidence is forthcoming. We may be allowed to think that too great an importance has been ascribed to the position of the early aldermen in connection with their wards. It is generally affirmed that the aldermen were hereditary owners of the various wards, on account of the fact that the wards were named after them, an instance of which practice remains in Farringdon, Bassishaw, and Basingshall. There is no evidence of this proprietorship, and it seems improbable on the face of it. Mr. Round believes that what an alderman inherited can only have been the aldermanry of his ward, like, he suggests, an hereditary sheriff. Mr. Badley writes that, quote, "Early in 1276 we find mention made of the ward of Henry de Frowick within the gate, i.e. Cripplegate, and 10 years later, circa 1285, he figures in the earliest list of aldermen extant in the city's records as alderman of the same ward. End quote. At the election of aldermen in 1291, 19 Edward I, 16 of the wards were named after the alderman and 8 after places, the latter being the wards of Cheap, Castle Baynard, Walebrook, Dewgate, Bridge, Portsoken, Vintry, and Bassishaw. At the election 2 years afterwards, 1293, all the wards were named with their proper names, and not after the alderman. The ward of Ludgate and Newgate presented Nicholas de Fanden, it being styled in the previous list, quote, the ward of William de Fanden. End quote. Many of the same names are found in the two lists, but they represent different individuals of the same family. The preamble to the list of elections in 1293 is of considerable interest. Quote, be it remembered that on Tuesday before the feast of St. Botolph, 21 Edward I, in the presence of Sir John le Breton, Warden of London, the whole commonalty of the city aforesaid was assembled, viz., from each ward the wealthier and wiser men, who each by their several wards elected for themselves aldermen freely of good will and of their full consent, and the aldermen so elected they presented to the warden aforesaid in this form, that all and singular the things which the aforesaid aldermen of their wisdom and discretion shall do and ordain for the government of the city and the maintenance of the king's peace, in conjunction with the warden and their superiors for the time being, shall be straitly observed, and shall be held ratified and confirmed before other provisions touching the commonalty without any challenge or opposition in the future. And each ward elected its alderman, for whom it would answer as to all his acts affecting the city, the commune, communam, and its estate. End quote. It will be seen from the above that the election of aldermen was only in the hands of a few of the, quote, wealthier and wiser men, end quote, of the wards, but later on the electors were freemen of the city, quote, paying scot and bearing lot. End quote. There was much difference of practice in the election of aldermen. Various orders were issued from time to time, and some of them fell out of use. In 1377 it was ordered that aldermen should be elected annually, as appears from the following entry in Letterbook H. Quote, 51 Edward III. Precept, Bill, for the men of each ward to meet on Saturday the 7th of March, and elect an alderman other than the sitting alderman, and to have the name of the alderman so elected endorsed on the bill at the Guildhall on the feast of St. Gregory next, at 8 o'clock at the latest, under penalty. End quote. This precept was elaborated in an ordinance made on Friday the 6th of March, 51 Edward III, with the assent of the mayor, aldermen, and diverse representations of the livery companies. It was ordered that, quote, aldermen removed for good and reasonable cause shall not be open for re-election, but that those who go out of office on St. Gregory's Day and have not misconducted themselves may be re-elected after the interval of 1 year. End quote. In 1384 the rule was modified so as to allow an alderman to be re-elected for his ward at the expiration of his year of office without any interval. Letterbook H. In 1394 the ordinance respecting annual elections was repealed by the king, and aldermen were henceforward elected for life. 6th of March, 17 Richard II. Quote, and have also ordained for the honour and greater increase of the good government of our said city, that they who should be chosen aldermen of our same city should not be removed out of their offices during their lives, unless for just, reasonable, and notable cause. End quote. Shortly after this, an order of the mayor, aldermen, and commonalty was issued which took away the right of the wards of directly electing their aldermen. A ward was only allowed to nominate 2 persons, of whom the mayor and aldermen were to choose one. 5 years later, that is in 1402, the number of names to be nominated was raised to 4, and in 1420 this order was reaffirmed. Footnote. In 1711, a return was made to the practice of nominating 2 persons only, followed in 1714 by, quote, an Act for reviving the ancient manner of electing aldermen, 13 Ann, which restored to the inhabitants of their ancient rights and privileges of choosing 1 person only to be their alderman. End quote. End of footnote. Distinct rank was accorded to aldermen. Thus the common seal of the corporation bears the inscription Sigillum Baronum Londiniarum, and we are told by John Carpenter in Liber Albus, quote, it is a matter of experience that even since the year of our Lord 1350, at the sepulture of aldermen, the ancient custom of interment with baronial honours was observed. For in the church where the alderman was about to be buried, a person appeared upon a caparisoned horse, arrayed in the armour of the deceased, bearing a banner in his hand, and carrying upon him his shield, helmet, and the rest of his arms, along with the banner, as is still the usage at the sepulture of lords of baronial rank. But by reason of the sudden and frequent changes of the alderman, and the repeated occurrence of pestilence, this ceremonial in London gradually died out and disappeared. End quote. When the poll tax of 1379 was imposed, the mayor was assessed as an earl, and the aldermen as barons. On August 12, 1417, a royal mandate, 5 Henry V, was issued to the mayor enjoining that the alderman shall reside within the city. Quote, we do therefore will and do command and charge you that you cause your letters to be addressed unto each one of the said aldermen so absent from our said city, charging them strictly thereby on our behalf, that they return unto our said city, and do tarry and remain there, to support you and to administer counsel and assistance in all that may touch the preservation of the said peace and good governance of our said city. End quote. This was an irksome regulation, and in the charter of Edward IV, the aldermen were released from the obligation. Quote, it is well known and manifest that those of the said city which are elected aldermen have sustained great cost and pains for the time they make their abode and residence in the same city, and for that cause oftentimes do leave their possessions and places in the country, that therefore they and every of them may, without fear of unquietness or molestation, peaceably abide and tarry in such their houses and possessions, when they shall return thither for comfort and recreation's sake. End quote. It has sometimes been the fashion of the wits to gird at the aldermen and other city magnates, but although some of the names on the list may be of little account, there are many which are written on the page of history, and a large number of noble families owe their origin to famous aldermen. Sir Geoffrey Boleyn, mayor in 1457, was great-grandfather to Anne Boleyn, and therefore ancestor of Queen Elizabeth. Sir Thomas Canning, mayor in 1456, was ancestor of George Canning, Earl Canning, and Lord Stratford de Redcliffe. Sir William Loke, sheriff in 1548, the favourite of Henry VIII, who had a key of the king's private chamber so that he might come whenever he would, was the ancestor of John Locke, Lord Chancellor King, and the Earl of Lovelace. John Cowper, alderman in 1551, was the ancestor of Lord Chancellor Cowper and the poet William Cowper. Sir Edward Osborne was the ancestor of the Duke of Leeds. Among other distinguished men descended from aldermen may be mentioned Bacon, Beckford, Byron, Cromwell, Howe, Marlborough, Newcastle, Melbourne, Nelson, Palmerston, the 2 William Pitts, Raglan, Salisbury, and the Walpoles. Sheriffs. The government of the city by reeves dates back to a very early period of our history, and these reeves were appointed by the king. When William the Conqueror demanded entrance to London, the joint governors were the bishop and the portreeve. How long before the conquest a portreeve had been appointed, and how long after his office was continued, we do not know. The sheriff to some extent took his place, but Henry I gave the city the right of appointing justiciars and sheriffs, and the justiciar, according to Mr. Round, took precedence of the sheriff. After the establishment of the commune and the appointment of a mayor, the sheriffs naturally lost much of their importance, and they became what they are styled in Liber Albus, quote, the eyes of the mayor, end quote. They often in early times were also called bailiffs. When Middlesex was infirm to London, the two sheriffs were equally sheriffs of London and Middlesex. There is one instance only in the city records of a sheriff of Middlesex being mentioned as distinct from the sheriffs, and this was in 1283, when Anquetin de Betteville and Walter le Blond are described as sheriffs of London, and Gérin as sheriff of Middlesex. Footnote: by the Local Government Act of 1888, the citizens of London were deprived of all right of jurisdiction over the county of Middlesex, which had been expressly granted by various charters. End of footnote. This anomaly has not been explained, but Dr. Sharp remarks respecting a writ of 1308, quote, the King to the Sheriff of Middlesex, greeting, end quote, that this was, quote, presumably addressed to, and the return made by the Sheriffs of London, acting as a Sheriff of Middlesex according to custom, end quote. It was ordained and agreed in 1383, 7 Richard II, quote, that no person shall from henceforth be mayor in the said city, if he have not first been sheriff of the said city, to the end that he may be tried in governance and bounty before he attain such estate of the mayoralty. End quote. Mr. Badley has very clearly described the changes made at various times in the election of sheriffs, and I therefore quote from his book. Quote, until the commencement of the 14th century, the sheriffs were elected by the mayor, aldermen, and commonalty of the city. In 1301, an attempt was made to restrict the number of electors to 12 representatives of each ward, but this, like other subsequent attempts, proved unsuccessful. In 1387 is met with, for the first time, a new method of procedure. In that year, one of the sheriffs was elected by the mayor and the other by the commonalty, and this prerogative of the mayor for the time being to elect one of the sheriffs continued to be exercised with few, if any, exceptions down to 1638. End quote. This is the mode of election which is described in the Liber Albus. Quote, in the first place, the mayor shall choose, of his own free will, a reputable man, free of the city, to be one of the sheriffs for the ensuing year, for whom he is willing to answer as to one half of the firm of the city due to the king, if he who is so elected by the mayor shall prove not sufficient. But if the mayor elect him by council and with the assent of the aldermen, they also ought to be answerable with him. And those who are elected for the common council themselves, and the others summoned by the mayor for this purpose, as before declared, shall choose another sheriff for the commonalty, for whom all the commonalty is bound to be answered as to the other half of the firm so due to the king, in case he shall prove not sufficient. And if any controversy arise between the commons as to the election, the matter is to proceed and be discussed. End quote. Footnote. Mr. Badley continues the account of the changes in the mode of election up to the present time. Quote, from 1642 to 1651, the mayor's claim to elect a sheriff was always contested. For the year 1652 and for some years afterwards, the mayor neither nominated nor elected a sheriff, but in 1662, when he would have elected one Bloodworth as sheriff, the commonalty claimed their right, although they accepted the mayor's nominee. The prerogative thus claimed by the mayor, although frequently challenged, was exercised for the most part by subsequent mayors down to 1674, when exception was taken to William Roberts, whom the mayor had formerly nominated, according to a custom which is said to have arisen in the time of Elizabeth, by drinking to him at a public banquet. In the following year, and for some years later, the mayor exercised his prerogative of electing one of the sheriffs without opposition. In 1703, an act was passed declaring the right of election of sheriffs to be in the liverymen of the several companies of the city in Common Hall assembled. End quote. It was, however, lawful for the Lord Mayor to nominate for the office. Quote, by an act of 1748, the Lord Mayor might continue to nominate to the extent of 9 persons in the whole. End quote. By an Act of Common Council in 1878, the right of election to the office of sheriff was vested in the liverymen of the several companies of the city in common hall assembled, the Lord Mayor nominating one or more freemen, not exceeding 3 in the whole, for the shrievalty. End of footnote. Common Council. We do not know when the Court of Common Council was first formed, but, as already stated, Mr. Round supposes it to have grown out of the body of échevins brought into being on the granting of a commune. It seems probable that the two courts, that of aldermen and that of the Common Council, were formed about the same time, but it is remarkable that we have at present no definite information on the subject. Now that special attention is drawn to this matter, it is to be hoped that some facts settling the question may be forthcoming. The number of members of the Common Council varied greatly at different times, but the right to determine the number was indirectly granted by the Charter of Edward III, 1341, which enables the city to amend customs and usages which have become hard. The preamble to an Act of Common Council, 8th of May, 1840, 3 Victoria, passed to reduce the total number of Common Council and to apportion more equally the members to the different wards, contains the following statement of its antiquity. Quote, "Whereas from time whereof the memory of man runneth not to the contrary, there hath existed, and still doth exist within the city of London, a Common Council consisting of the mayor and aldermen of the said city, and certain citizens, being freemen of the said city, annually elected to be of the same council, and called the Commons of the said city. And whereas, under and by virtue of the ancient charters, ordinances, statutes, and customs of the said city, the power of appointing and regulating the number of citizens to be, from time to time, elected of the same Common Council hath, from time whereof the memory of man runneth not to the contrary, belonged, and still of right doth belong, to the mayor, aldermen, and commons of the said city." End quote. The Common Council were chosen by the wards until 1351, 25 Edward III, when certain companies appointed the Common Council. In 1376, 50 Edward III, an ordinance was made by the mayor and aldermen with the assent of the whole commons, to the effect that the companies should select men with whom they were content, and none other should come to the election of mayors and sheriffs; that the greater companies should not elect more than 6, the lesser 4, and the least 2. 47 companies nominated 156 members. In 1383 the right of election reverted to the wards, but was obtained again by the companies in 1467. Arms of London. The arms of the City of London are simple and of great interest, consisting as they do of the cross of St. George with the sword of St. Paul in the dexter quarter. But unfortunately an absurd popular blunder has been prevalent that the sword was really the dagger with which Sir William Walworth killed Wat Tyler. The history of these arms is fully set forth in Jewett and Hope's Corporation Plate, and there illustrated with figures of the old Common Seal of London, and the first and second Mayoralty seals. The facts as there set forth are shortly stated here. The old Common Seal is a fine example of the early part of the 13th century. Stowe in his Survey dates it in 1224, and Gregory in his Chronicle in 1227 to 1228. Mr. Hope says that the seal may well be of a date circa 1225, and that it certainly was in use in 1246. The obverse of the seal represents a figure of St. Paul with a sword in his outstretched right hand, and a banner of England in his left hand. Quote, "The saint is represented as standing in the middle of the city over which he keeps guard. The spire of the cathedral church rises in front of him, and other steeples on each side. In front of all is the city wall with its ditch, with lofty central gateway and 2 lesser flanking towers or bastions." End quote. The legend is Sigillum Baronum Londoniarum. The first Mayoralty seal bears the figures of St. Thomas of Canterbury and St. Paul with his sword. The legend is Sigillum Mayoratus London, and the date circa 1280. The second mayoralty seal, which was produced a century after the first one, is of very special interest. It bears seated figures of St. Thomas and St. Paul, and in base a shield of the city supported by two lions. The legend is Sigil Majoratus Civitatis, London. The record of the making of this seal in 1381 is found in Letterbook K, and Mr. Hope's remarks on the value of this piece of evidence must be quoted entire. Quote, "This seal is of special interest, not only from its being a dated example, but because it proves beyond doubt the absurdity of the silly notion that the object in the dexter chief of the city arms is the sword or dagger wherewith Sir William Walworth slew Wat Tyler, instead of being, as it undoubtedly is, the sword of St. Paul. Wat Tyler was killed on June 15, 1381, whereas the new seal of the mayoralty had been formally adopted on April 17, 2 months before. This seal is also one of the earliest authorities for the city arms. Its silver matrix is still preserved at the Mansion House, but in so worn a condition that little else than the deepest parts can be traced. It is only now used for mercantile documents going abroad." End quote. To return to the common seal, it may be noticed here that the original reverse had, quote, "in base a view of the city somewhat resembling that on the obverse, surmounted by a segmental arch. On top of the arch, seated on a throne or chair of state, is a figure of St. Thomas of Canterbury with a cross and Paul." End quote. In accordance with the famous proclamation of Henry VIII, November 16, 1538, which enacted that Thomas Becket should no longer, quote, "be esteemed, named, reputed, nor called a saint, but Bishop Becket, and that his images and pictures through the whole realm shall be put down," end quote, etc., it was enacted in 1539 that this reverse of the common seal should be destroyed. Quote, "The beautiful reverse of the common seal, after doing duty for over 3 centuries, was therefore broken up, and presumably its silver used to make a new matrix. This is of the same size as its predecessor, but in accordance with the resolution, it bears for device simply the city arms, argent a cross gules, and in the dexter quarter the sword of St. Paul, with helm, mantling and crest, a dragon's wing expanded argent charged with a cross gules. The legend is Londini defende tuos deus optime cives." End quote. In connection with the arms, it may be noticed that the supporters, which are usually described as griffins, are really dragons, in allusion to St. George. End of Chapter 8. End of Section 17.